Hello there, and welcome to Extinction Rebellion's presentation, Heading for Extinction and What to Do About It. My name is Louise. I'm a member of Extinction Rebellion Vancouver Island, based in Victoria. We are delivering this presentation from the traditional ancestral land of the Lekwungen-speaking people. We stand in solidarity with Indigenous people here and around the world who continue to lead the climate justice movement as stewards of the planet. Thanks for investing your time to hear this talk. Our presentation is based on the work of Dr. Gail Bradbrook, one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion, and a PhD in molecular biophysics. This is a collective creation adapted for our context on Vancouver Island. We'll be sharing difficult information and asking some uncomfortable questions. Part 1, Heading for Extinction, contains the scariest stuff. It is a summary of the latest climate science to help you appreciate the scope and gravity of the climate emergency. While Part 2, What to Do About It, is more cautiously positive, it highlights how political systems have failed to take adequate action and points out social science that supports how we can make big societal and system changes. So what brings you to spend time with this presentation today? It's an important question. I invite you to take a minute and ground yourself in your personal answers to that question. Thanks for getting into your feelings about the climate emergency. We've been trained to be optimistic about climate change and focus on hope. This has created a false sense of security that blinds us to reality. XR has a guiding principle: tell the truth and act as if the truth is real. We're here to tell the truth about the climate emergency and what we need to do to survive it. This might leave you angry, despairing, and grieving. Those feelings are completely appropriate and completely rational responses to this information. So let's dig into Part 1, Heading for Extinction, beginning with some scientific facts and predictions. This slide shows average global warming. It's alarming. This is the amount of warming we've experienced to date. It varies across the planet, but the global average temperature has increased 1 degree. Canada is warming at twice that rate, and parts of the Arctic are at a 3-degree rise. With a 1 degree warming, there are serious impacts to the natural world. Vulnerable ecosystems, such as coral reefs, are dying. Frequency of extreme weather events is increasing. Our ability to grow crops is depressed, and the amount of heat-related loss of human and animal life is increasing. So what does the future hold? At 1 degree of warming, we've seen massive wildfires in Australia, one of the rare instances where impacts are hitting white middle-class people. Indigenous people in the Arctic face displacement and loss of ways of living, but most displaced people are in the global south and the developing nations. In Victoria, 57% of our emissions come from our own transportation choices. Our emissions are actually increasing each year. 2019 was a record high. Carbon dioxide rose to 415 parts per million. That's the highest it's been in millions of years. No human being has ever existed in an environment with this much CO2. Canada has 0.5% of the world's population, but we produce 2% of world emissions. That's 4 times the average, and the second highest of any G20 economy. We are second only to Saudi Arabia. That's great company we're keeping. So where does reliable climate change information come from? From science, of course. It builds knowledge through research, review, and consensus. So individual publications are peer-reviewed, then the data is debated and pulled apart more rigorously by experts in the field looking for errors. That means only the strongest conclusions are accepted. The IPCC report is a mainstream, non-controversial science, and its conclusions are supported by the most cautious, conservative members of the scientific community. The IPCC report in October 2018 delivered a dire warning. We need to slash our global emissions in half by 2030. That's just 10 years away. And we need to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise. 1.5 degrees Celsius is not good, but a 2 degrees Celsius temperature rise is terrible, and the difference is extreme. Even 1.5 isn't safe. It will lead to massive global adjustments with loss of human life and biodiversity. Here's what some conservative scientists have to say. This is Eric Solheim, Executive Director of the UN Environment Program. It's like a deafening smoke alarm going off in the kitchen. We have to put out the fire. And this is Dr. Deborah Roberts, co-chair of the IPCC Impacts Group. She said, it's a line in the sand, and what it says to our species is that this is the moment, and we must act now. The next few years are probably the most important in our history. I'm going to talk you through 3 scenarios of what could happen next. The black line represents emissions that have already happened. The yellow-green lines represent a magic wand scenario, in which we stop all emissions now. We know that's not going to happen, but even if it did, warming wouldn't stop immediately. We would still see a 1.3 to 1.7 degrees of warming within 80 years. It's baked in. Even a magic wand can't wish it away. If everyone around the world keeps their climate action promises, including our Paris Agreement pledges, what happens? The blue line indicates we are headed for 3 degrees of warming. This is our optimistic best policies scenario. At twice the limits set out by the IPCC, we'll see coral reefs virtually extinct, massive crop failures, no Arctic sea ice, very frequent severe weather events, southern Europe in permanent drought, sea level rise swallowing cities from Miami to Jakarta. This brings a high risk of abrupt, irreversible impacts of climate change. The gray area is what we get with business as usual. If we keep on with what we are doing, there will be a 4 degree to 6 degrees Celsius rise, according to the IPCC. This is catastrophic beyond human comprehension. These 3 scenario predictions for the state of the climate are based on our best knowledge. Have our climate change predictions been correct so far? Well, the answer is no. Recently on the news, we were told that permafrost, that's the ground that stays frozen for at least 2 years, permafrost in the Canadian Arctic is already melting at a rate that was predicted by the IPCC to occur in 2090. That's 70 years ahead of schedule. This graph illustrates the total area of sea ice in the Arctic lost. The black line indicates the average predicted decline, and the red line shows what scientists have observed. For several years, there was a steady decline, as scientists expected. But from the late 2000s, the area of multi-year ice dropped off significantly. Observed declines are much greater than even the worst IPCC predictions. Most climate prediction models have underestimated the changes dramatically, leading some scientists to break ranks. This is Professor Hans Schellenhuber. He's the head of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, the senior advisor to the Pope and to German Chancellor Angela Merkel and the European Union, a very credible voice. He's saying climate change is reaching the end game, the issue of the very survival of our civilization. 11,000 scientists recently signed a letter stating, "We declare clearly and unequivocally that planet Earth is facing a climate emergency. The climate crisis has arrived, and it is accelerating faster than most scientists expected. It is more severe than anticipated, threatening natural ecosystems and the fate of humanity." Why are we seeing things we don't expect with climate change? We can't answer this whole question, but let's talk a bit about feedback loops and tipping points. The albedo effect is an example of a feedback loop. As the climate warms, reflective ice melts and is replaced by darker ocean water. which in turn absorbs more heat, like wearing a black shirt on a sunny day. So more heat, which melts more ice, creating a feedback loop, accelerating the overall melting of ice. Climate change is not simply a matter of cause and effect. It's more like a vicious circle. Forests take up carbon and slow down climate change. Canada's boreal forests hold about 12% of the world's land-based carbon reserves. Forests in general have moderated climate change by absorbing 1/4 of the carbon emitted by human activities. In Canada, our forests have not been a net carbon sink since 2001. They are being weakened by drought, logging, wildfires, and increasing attacks by insects that thrive in the warmer, drier conditions. These BC forests are red, with trees killed by one species of beetle. In a single year, this released more CO2 than 40 years of wildfires across Canada. As forests warm, other feedback loops kick in and exacerbate the problem. These feedback loops are underrepresented or missing from mainstream climate models. Tipping points are the main cause of unpredictability with climate change. A tipping point is that point at which change reaches a threshold and then runs away like a ball rolling down a hill, accelerating beyond our grasp. When feedback loops intersect, they can cause domino effects or cascades of feedback loops. A 2018 paper by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences titled Hothouse Earth examined several different feedback loops. Permafrost thaw, a loss of ocean floor methane hydrates, weakening land and ocean carbon sinks, and more. These feedback loops could tip Earth from a 2 degrees Celsius increase into this hothouse state permanently. According to one of the lead authors of the paper, Johan Rockström, executive director of the Stockholm Resilience Center, 50 years ago, this would have been dismissed as alarmist, but now scientists are really worried. What does this mean for our future based on our accelerating emissions? A recent paper from the University of Washington said that holding to a 2 degrees Celsius rise within the lifetime of the people born today is highly unlikely. Because of feedback loops and tipping points, changes will not be linear. They're already happening at an accelerating pace. We're already in uncharted territory with climate change acceleration. As we head into this gray area, we know less and less about where it's going. We only have a 1% chance of remaining below a 1.5 degrees Celsius rise, and only a 5% chance that temperatures will be less than 2 degrees higher. Likely, we'll see between 2 and 5 degrees rise within your lifetime, with horrendous consequences. So our predictions for the future are terrifying and uncertain. We can't treat these uncertainties as safety nets. That said, there are some things we do know about what the future holds. Sea level rise is something that we all hear about. Our lower mainland is in trouble, as are Ottawa, Montreal, and Halifax. Greater Victoria, while less vulnerable, would still be devastated. Sea rise will affect Vancouver at 1.5 degrees warming, only a half a degree warmer than now. Richmond, Surrey, Coquitlam, and parts of the North Shore will be underwater. At this pace, we could hit a 1.5 degree rise by 2030. By 2050, 140 million to 1 billion people around the world will be affected by sea level rise and resulting flooding. The 21st century will see escalating migration from the most vulnerable cities. Shanghai will be inundated, Miami devastated. Oxfam reports roughly 20 million people have become climate refugees each year in the last decade due to unstoppable sea level rise. That's one person every 2 seconds. Will we welcome people here when their homes are gone? Will we have to move? Sea level rise isn't the only way we'll lose lands to climate change. Desertification and unreliable rainfall are already causing reduced crop yields. This graph plots trends in global hunger at 1 degree Celsius of warming, indicating the number of undernourished people in the world. It was on decline until 2014, when the trend reversed. Climate-related shocks are key drivers to this increase. Migration and hunger bring political and social consequences and enormous human costs. The most marginalized are the most affected. The bonds that hold nature together are unraveling. Many plants and animals are threatened with extinction right now. The number is astronomically higher than a typical background rate, confirming that we are in the 6th mass extinction. Scientists call it biological annihilation. There have been 5 major extinctions in the geological record, all associated with very rapid increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide. We've wiped out 60% of animal populations since the 1970s, according to the World Wildlife Living Planet report. That's like annihilating all humans from North America, South America, Europe, Africa, China, and Oceania. This year, a UN report warned that 1 million species may be pushed to extinction. The staggering variety of species that provide critical services in our life support system are under threat. BC has 1,807 species at risk of extinction, more than any other province or territory in Canada. And that's just the big stuff, like caribou, salmon, and orcas. The essential interconnected web of life on Earth is getting smaller. About 80% of the biodiversity on Earth is on Indigenous lands and territories. While Indigenous peoples continue to fight for their territorial rights, they defend the natural life-giving systems whose survival underpins our own. Leanne Etisamoke Simpson of the Anishinaabe Nations in the Great Lakes region explains, Indigenous peoples have witnessed continual ecosystem and species collapse since the early days of colonial occupation. We should be thinking of climate change as part of a much longer series of ecological catastrophes caused by colonialism and accumulation-based society. Inuit activist Sela Watt Cloutier has witnessed the magnitude of the loss of Arctic sea ice. Our sea ice, which has allowed for safe travel for our hunters and provided a strong habitat for our mammals, is deteriorating. The human fatalities that have been caused by thinning ice, the animals that may face extinction, the crumbling coastlines, the communities that we're having to relocate. In other words, the many ways that our rights to life, health, property, and a means of subsistence are being violated by a dramatically changing climate. Anishinaabe scholar Kyle Powys White explains that for Indigenous people, there is a kinship between humans and non-humans in the ecosystem. Ecosystems are not to be dominated, but respected and asked for their consent to sustain human and non-human communities alike. As the human-caused climate emergency accelerates, the impacts are felt more by the oppressed. It's time to recognize this and take action. Poorer people in the global south are worse off than richer people here who have caused this problem, but inequities also persist in richer countries. Vulnerable people will be worse off. Indigenous communities, children, people with chronic illness, people without adequate housing or food. Climate statistics don't say much about the real costs to all living things. Mass migrations, crop failures, depleted resources, and relentless disasters create a perfect breeding ground for aggression, racism, corruption, even fascism. Around the world, authoritarian governments gain power on the backs of desperate people as they struggle against inequality and poverty. Imagine the instability caused by 1 billion climate refugees on the move. The chance to address climate change in a cooperative, mutually beneficial way is rapidly shrinking. When the climate emergency is on our doorsteps, that window will close. Could climate change and ecological breakdown wipe out humanity? Global heating is already taking people's lives around the world. We are headed for unprecedented human suffering and death. Will it take a threat of human extinction to motivate us to act? According to a 2017 paper by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, even the climate change scenarios with a low probability, that is 1 in 20 chance of happening, could lead to human extinction. We would never get on a plane with a 1 in 20 chance of it coming down, but we are willing to send our children and our grandchildren on that plane. What we just shared was upsetting, and we took a risk in explaining it to you. Take a few seconds to quietly absorb all of the information and sit with whatever you feel. Panic, grief, anger, or despair are normal, so we must take time to process our feelings. Facing grief takes courage, and we can shift our consciousness. It's time to mourn the future we thought we had as comfortable citizens and consumers. After the mourning, we change things. Choosing to face difficult facts and take action is a new kind of human maturity that we'll need to secure a future for all life on the planet. We also have to take care of ourselves and attend to our feelings so we're able to do the things that could make the difference. Grief is not a disorder, a disease, or a sign of weakness. It is an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity. It's the price you pay for love. The only cure for grief is to grieve. Over the past 50 years, we've been trained to be optimistic about climate change and to focus on hope. This has created a false sense of security that blinds us to current reality of the climate crisis. According to Eric Holthaus, meteorologist and journalist, if you're trying to motivate people to change, scaring the shit out of them is a really bad strategy. But hiding our heads in the sand, as some NGOs, governments, and the media have done, is less helpful. They downplay the crisis because they have no hope to offer. Extinction Rebellion offers a way for you to take action once you know the truth, and this might give you hope. Some people who hear the truth, that we're headed for 4 degrees of warming, think it's disastrous and want to do something. These upstanders have a different mindset. Something they have experienced makes them stand up and rebel for the greater good. We don't need to persuade everyone, so we're focusing on connecting with upstanders. We don't dumb down the information to avoid scaring anyone. We appeal to upstanders who respond to the scary truth of climate science. As you and I and thousands of people in over 70 countries taking it to the streets with Extinction Rebellion to face this emergency. So what sort of action do we need to take? Our actions must be founded in relationships between humans and all living things, as reflected in Indigenous wisdom. Indigenous peoples have been on this continent for 14,000 years, or 4 times as long as the pyramids have been in Egypt. They've lived without industrial technology from time immemorial. Their survival wasn't passive or lucky. They learned that respectful relationships with all other life is essential to our planet and essential to our survival on the planet. We are finally recognizing scientifically the wisdom held by Indigenous peoples about the need to live as a part of this planet. Many of us here have been responding to the crisis by sending letters and emails, donating to climate groups, getting out the vote, signing petitions, going on marches, taking the bus, or changing light bulbs. It's time to tell the truth. These incremental tactics have catastrophically failed to bring about the necessary changes. Our economic and governance systems need a radical global scale redesign, or perpetual industrial growth will end human civilization. Individuals alone cannot solve this problem, but we each need to be part of it. Governments must take responsibility and make massive changes. Canadian governments routinely miss their own feeble climate targets. The 1992 Rio targets, the 2005 Kyoto targets, the 2020 Copenhagen targets, and for certain we will miss our 2030 Paris targets. Heads buried in the tar sands, Canada ignores the truth published in its own reports from Environment and Climate Change Canada. On June 17th, Trudeau declared a national climate emergency, another non-binding PR stunt. The next day, he purchased the 65-year-old Trans Mountain Pipeline for $4.5 billion. Canada spends $3.3 billion in big oil subsidies every year. Canada gives $30 billion in direct subsidies to fossil fuel extraction projects. Justin Trudeau assured us Trans Mountain will fund Canada's clean future economy. As if tar sands revenues will remove the megatons of CO2 released by pushing bitumen through a pipeline. Pivoting on his heel again, Prime Minister Trudeau announced $3 billion over 10 years to plant trees, 1/10 as much as he gives to the fossil fuel extraction industry. The trouble is, it will be almost a century before today's saplings are mature enough to sequester a meaningful amount of carbon. We have less than 6 years. Canada is warming at twice the global rate. The Canadian Arctic is warming at 3 times the global rate. Our government knows the problem is accelerating because of human activities. Is our government acting on this knowledge as if climate crisis is real? No. Like governments around the world, they have failed to act at a scale and speed that would matter, even though it is within their power to do so. So what is the appropriate response to their dereliction of duty? The second part of our name is rebellion. Rebellion is often associated with uprisings against oppression and extreme politics that is threatening the well-being of citizens. Climate change threatens our values, rights, and lives, regardless of our politics. There isn't left or right or party politics. This is about survival across the biosphere. War and terrorism are threats to national security and peace that will be intensified by climate breakdown. Governments across the political spectrum are failing to protect their citizens. A mass extinction is approaching. Today, we are inviting you to a rebellion against extinction. Strategic, nonviolent, direct action is a major system of resistance based on the assumption that hierarchical systems can be modified or dismantled by a withdrawal of submission, cooperation, and obedience. How do we withdraw submission, cooperation, and obedience from a system that will destroy us? This guy, seriously, Extinction Rebellion strategies are defined by 4 strategic, nonviolent direct action principles: respectful, disruptive, sacrificial, and backfiring. Rebellion must be respectful. Nonviolence isn't just limited to not punching someone in the face. It really means a state of such open-heartedness that there is no room for hatred. If you're respectful, people are more likely to listen. It's a rebellion, but without violence and without hatred or shaming anyone. How can disruption accomplish anything? Well, it's a demand for change, not a plea. The economic costs of disruption get the attention of corporations and governments. Governments prioritize getting elected. Corporations prioritize profits. So, labor strikes are effective against companies by disrupting their profits. Closing down a capital city is effective against governments by undermining their control of the social narrative and the status quo. Disruption is essential, and it's protected within your democratic rights. Even nonviolent rebellion is sacrificial. Rebellion by striking or putting your body on the line or risking arrest to block something harmful. You are making a personal sacrifice. You show you're serious and earn respect and credibility and inspire others to act in solidarity with your cause. We are serious. Climate disaster is the end of human life as we know it. So being that serious and undertaking personal sacrifice is the only way forward. Nonviolent rebellion creates a backfiring response. By sitting peacefully in the streets to disrupt business as usual, you put authorities in a lose-lose position. If they let you stay, you get publicity while demonstrating your power and determination. If they forcibly remove you or arrest you, people who witness it might be inspired to support you. When others witness your courage, their own fears abate, possibly inspiring them to join the movement against destructive forces. This is Philip Kinghorn. He was arrested 4 times in 12 days in April 2019 in London. That was sacrificial and inspiring. This kind of rebellion is interesting and unusual, but can it work? Harvard professor Erica Chenoweth studied 300 violent and nonviolent uprisings since 1900 and found direct action that is nonviolent is twice as likely to succeed as a violent action. Chenoweth also found that although popular support is important, you don't need everybody to actively stand up. She found we only need 3.5% of a population to rebel in order to change the system. Her research confirms that Extinction Rebellion's absolute commitment to nonviolence is the most effective type of rebellion. This famous movement used the same principles and succeeded with less than 3.5% of the population. Before the mid-1950s, the American Civil Rights Movement tried the usual political channels, but didn't have much impact. After the mid-1950s, they used strategic nonviolent direct action, sustained and escalated over time. Several hundred people went to prison, and thousands more got arrested. Freedom riders deliberately sat in places they were not supposed to sit. Their numbers grew from 13 to 4,400. Within a year, they had changed a racist policy on the buses and trains. Nonviolent civil disobedience has a long history, and it still works. Closer to home, in 1993, we had the Clayoquot Sound War in the Woods, in response to the BC government's decision to allow logging in 74% of Vancouver Island's ancient forests. Over 3 months, more than 12,000 protesters blockaded a logging road. 850 were arrested and charged in the largest case of peaceful civil disobedience in Canadian history. Their nonviolent direct action rebellion worked. They raised international awareness of logging in temperate rainforests, which led to policies that protect areas of old-growth forests. Extinction Rebellion is doing non-violent direct action here on Vancouver Island, across Canada, and in 72 other countries. Since its founding in May 2018, XRVI has inspired a global movement. There have been 3 major weeks-long climate strikes in London and countless smaller actions around the UK. XR has changed the conversation on the climate crisis, telling the truth about the grave social and economic consequences of failing to get to net zero carbon emissions in the next 6 years. Nonviolent rebellion works, but it will take sacrifice, and for some, that will mean being arrested. It isn't necessary to risk arrest to be an effective part of XR. In direct actions, most participants are at little risk of arrest. XR recognizes that some people, such as people of color and Indigenous people, are more likely to face severe consequences if arrested. Some will risk arrest, but no one will question your choice if you don't. It is not necessary to risk arrest to be active and effective in XR, but we have support networks for those who will get arrested. We'll have people on call to pick up arrestees at the police station, provide legal support, even people who will feed and walk your pets. We also have people trained in conflict de-escalation and to act as liaison with the police. So what are we demanding in this rebellion? Extinction Rebellion is not about random uprisings. Successful civil disobedience must be intentional, planned, and have a clear goal. Extinction Rebellion has 3 global demands, and XR Canada is working on a 4th. First, we demand that government tell the truth by declaring a climate and ecological emergency, working with other institutions to communicate the urgency for action. Governments have experience with public campaigns informed by scientific evidence to create laws that bring about positive social change. That's how we got good laws about seatbelts, drinking and driving, smoking. Extinction Rebellion is asking for urgent action on laws that protect our health and safety in the climate emergency. We are demanding that governments tell citizens the scientific truth about the climate crisis and its causes. Government needs to hold media, business, and educational institutions to higher standards of truth-telling so the public isn't deceived into lethal false hopes. Second, we demand that all levels of government act now to halt biodiversity loss and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025. We need government to set ambitious and specific targets. The IPCC says net zero by 2050 leaves room for too many known unknowns and many more unknown unknowns. 2050 is lethally late. Many climate change models used for the IPCC report that's due in 2021 are shocking scientists by showing the rate of climate change is twice as fast as was suggested in the last report. Net carbon neutral in 5 years is a big ask. So how do we get there? According to the science journal Nature, fossil fuel projects ensure we will overshoot our goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius rise. Emissions will increase by 30% unless we stop all planned and in-progress fossil fuel extraction projects. Over 1/3 of that development is planned to happen in Canada. To get net emissions to zero in 5 years, we need to cancel all planned and in-progress fossil fuel distribution infrastructure projects. How could we ever get that done? Well, we need a mobilization like the war effort during World War II. Entire economies were transformed within months. The narrative that we must all pull together across the political spectrum was pushed hard and was powerful. With few technological or financial barriers, we can replicate this strategy to fight climate change. Nothing new needs to be invented. We could just deploy at scale existing solutions that work, but we need the social and political will to act now. Our third demand is that government create a citizens' assembly on climate and ecological justice and act immediately on what they recommend. 100 or so citizens would be randomly selected and empowered to push government to prioritize our health and safety rather than corporate profits. They would need to be informed by experts and required to draft strategic recommendations and an action plan to address the climate emergency without influence from business or government. Citizens' assemblies have been used in Ireland, the Netherlands, Poland, and even here in BC. Extinction Rebellion in the UK is contacting 30,000 households from which to select a citizens' assembly. Government must respect Indigenous sovereignty, must dissolve the Indian Act and all of its reforms, respect powers of veto in matters of consent and consensus, and respect Indigenous law, honor UNDRIP in its entirety. This is Kate Marvel, a top climate scientist with NASA, speaking about why we act. She says, "As a climate scientist, I am often asked to talk about hope. Climate change is bleak, the organizers always say. Tell us a happy story, give us some hope. The problem is I don't have any. What we need is courage. Courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending." In the words of Winona Laduke, Anishinaabe activist, rural development economist, and executive director of Honor the Earth, now is the time to choose the green path over the scorched path. It's time for this generation to summon up our courage, vision, and prayers. They have the money, but we have the people. And we also have a vision for life in the future. Well, now that we have walked through some of the terrifying facts about the climate emergency, will you be able to look your children in the eye and say you did everything you could? Are you ready to take action in a rebellion against extinction? Welcome to Extinction Rebellion.